Have you ever felt like you were carrying a weight no one else could see? A burden so heavy, yet so invisible, that even you began to doubt its existence? From the moment a boy takes his first breath, an unspoken contract is placed upon him. A set of expectations that define his worth, his strength, and his place in the world. He must be tough, he must be resilient, and above all, he must be silent. But who decided that men must suffer in silence? Who wrote the invisible rules that say vulnerability is weakness, and that emotions are chains rather than bridges? These ideas are not born within us. They are inherited, passed down like an ancient script written by generations before us. In the eyes of society, masculinity is a suit of armor, one that is meant to shield, to protect, to endure. But what happens when that armor becomes too heavy? What happens when it suffocates rather than shields? For centuries, men have been told to suppress their emotions, to shoulder their pain alone, to equate suffering with strength. But this silent burden comes at a cost that manifests in anxiety, depression, broken relationships, and an ever-growing sense of isolation. And yet we rarely question it. We rarely stop and ask, is this the only way to be a man? This script is not just an exploration of masculinity. It's a deconstruction of its hidden burdens, a journey through history, psychology, and philosophy to uncover the truth about what it means to be a man in today's world. We will dive into the ancient roots of masculine ideals, the psychological consequences of emotional suppression, and the way modern society reinforces these invisible chains. But most importantly, we will ask the question that so few dare to ask. What if true masculinity isn't about endurance, but about liberation? Because once you see the weight, once you truly recognize it for what it is, you have the power to put it down. Are you ready to begin? The silent burden of masculinity. Have you ever noticed how men carry an invisible weight, one that no one talks about, yet everyone expects them to bear? It's a weight that isn't measured in pounds or pressure, but in expectations, silent, unspoken, and ever-present. From the moment a boy enters the world, an unspoken script is handed to him. He is expected to be strong, to endure, to suppress emotions that might be seen as weak. Vulnerability, that is a luxury he is rarely afforded. Society shapes him before he even understands himself. Strength is not an option, it is a requirement. The burden of masculinity is not simply about being male, it is about performing masculinity in a way that is deemed acceptable. This weight is not something men consciously choose to carry. It is given to them by their fathers, their mentors, their culture. It is a legacy of silent endurance passed from one generation to the next. A man who cries is weak. A man who hesitates is uncertain. A man who struggles is failing. These ideas do not have to be spoken aloud to be deeply ingrained. They exist in the way boys are told to man up, in the way men are expected to handle their problems alone, in the way emotions are dismissed as unnecessary distractions. But what does this burden cost? It costs men their emotional freedom, their ability to form deep connections, and, in many cases, their very well-being. Mental health statistics paint a bleak reality. Men suffer from higher rates of depression, substance abuse, and even suicide. Yet they are less likely to seek help. The weight they carry is real, and yet they are expected to do so in silence. The question is, where did this burden come from? And why has it persisted for so long? The idea of masculinity, as we know it today, did not emerge from nature. It was shaped by history, by mythology, by philosophy. To truly understand this invisible weight, we must look at where it began, in ancient civilizations, in the legends of warriors, in the philosophical frameworks that have defined what it means to be a man. Because only by tracing its origins can we begin to dismantle it. Masculinity through time, a historical and mythological perspective. Have you ever questioned where the ideals of masculinity truly come from? Are they natural, or were they carefully crafted over centuries, shaped by myth, philosophy, and society's unspoken rules? The way men are expected to think, feel, and act is not random. It is a script written long before they were born. To understand masculinity today, we must trace its origins, peeling back the layers of history and myth that have defined what it means to be a man. In the ancient world, masculinity was synonymous with strength, duty, and endurance. From the warrior kings of Mesopotamia to the disciplined legions of Rome, a man's worth was measured by his ability to conquer, protect, and endure suffering without complaint. This ideal was immortalized in mythology, where heroes embodied the highest virtues of manhood, but often at an unbearable cost. Take Achilles, the tragic warrior of Greek mythology. Born with godlike strength and unmatched skill in battle, he became the ultimate symbol of masculine power. Yet his life was defined by rage, vengeance, and an unrelenting need to prove his worth. His downfall was not weakness, but an inability to escape the rigid expectations placed upon him. Achilles' story asks a haunting question. Is masculinity a source of power, or is it a prison? This theme repeats across history. In Norse mythology, Odin, the wise, warlike god, sacrifices his eye for knowledge, while Thor, the god of thunder, wields his strength as both a weapon and a burden. These myths reinforce the idea that masculinity required sacrifice. To be a man was to give up comfort, vulnerability, and even one's life for honor. The archetypes of manhood, Carl Jung's four faces of masculinity. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung believed that masculinity was not a singular concept, but a collection of archetypes, deeply embedded in the human psyche. According to Jung, every man carries within him four fundamental masculine energies: the warrior, the fearless fighter, disciplined, focused, and willing to battle for a cause; the king, the leader, protector, and ruler, embodying wisdom and authority; the magician, the seeker of knowledge, introspective, mastering skills and the unseen; the lover, the emotional, creative, and passionate side, deeply connected to beauty and relationships. Historically, societies have prioritized the warrior and king while suppressing the magician and lover. Strength and leadership were rewarded, but emotion, introspection, and vulnerability were dismissed as weaknesses. The result? A world where men feel pressured to fight and rule, but rarely to feel or reflect. Over time, these ancient ideals became more than just myths. They became a silent contract passed down through generations. Boys were taught not just how to be men, but what kind of men they were allowed to be. Society dictated that strength was power and vulnerability was failure. Honor was earned through sacrifice, and emotions were a distraction. But here's the paradox. The same society that glorifies masculine strength also fears its consequences. When men suppress pain, it festers. When emotions are ignored, they become destructive. History has shaped masculinity into a rigid ideal. But is it time to rewrite the script? The psychological toll. What happens when men suppress their pain? Have you ever wondered what happens to emotions left unspoken? When pain is buried, where does it go? The weight of unexpressed emotions doesn't disappear. It lingers, corrodes, and resurfaces in ways we least expect. The pressure to remain strong, composed, and unaffected creates an invisible prison that many men never escape. Beneath the surface of resilience often lies a battlefield of suppressed suffering, one that manifests in anxiety, depression, and self-destruction. But why is this struggle so common, yet so rarely acknowledged? From childhood, many boys receive the same unspoken lesson. Emotion is a liability. Tears are met with disapproval, vulnerability is seen as a weakness, and asking for help is often ridiculed rather than encouraged. The phrase "man up" becomes a warning, a reminder that to survive one must endure in silence. This conditioning shapes the male psyche in profound ways. Instead of learning how to process pain, many men learn to compartmentalize it, bury it, or channel it into aggression. Some pour themselves into work, seeking validation through productivity. Others resort to self-isolation, numbing their emotions through distraction or addiction. But no matter how deeply these emotions are buried, they don't disappear. They resurface, often in destructive ways. Psychologists have long studied the effects of emotional suppression, and the findings are alarming. Studies show that men who suppress emotions are at a significantly higher risk for stress-related illnesses, cardiovascular disease, and mental health disorders. The pressure to appear unaffected creates a state of chronic stress, where the body remains in a constant fight-or-flight mode. But the most insidious effect isn't just physical, it's existential. When emotions are never expressed, the inner self becomes fragmented. Men who suppress their pain often experience emotional numbness, a detachment from feelings, relationships, and even personal desires. Explosive anger. Repressed emotions often surface in the form of uncontrollable rage, chronic dissatisfaction, a sense of emptiness despite external success, self-destruction, increased rates of substance abuse, reckless behavior, and self-harm. The paradox of the strong man. Society glorifies the strong, silent man, yet it offers no support when that silence turns into suffering. The paradox is clear. Men are expected to endure, yet they are punished for the consequences of that endurance. A man who never expresses pain is considered strong, but a man who breaks under pressure is met with shame. This contradiction creates a vicious cycle. Men suffer in silence, fearing that revealing their struggles will make them less of a man. This is why men are statistically less likely to seek therapy, less likely to discuss their emotions, and more likely to suffer in isolation. The consequences are devastating. Studies show that men are nearly 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, not because they feel pain any less, but because they have been taught that expressing it is unacceptable. So what happens when a man carries his pain alone? What happens when he is never given permission to be vulnerable? The cost is clear. Broken relationships, unfulfilled lives, and an epidemic of silent suffering. But this raises an urgent question. If masculinity has been built on the foundation of endurance, is it possible to redefine strength itself? If strength is not about suppressing emotions, but understanding them, then the entire narrative of masculinity must evolve. The question is, who will rewrite the story? The modern warrior. How society reinforces the burden. Have you ever noticed how the world demands strength from men, yet offers no space for their struggle? Society glorifies the image of the unbreakable man, the one who stands tall, unshaken, invulnerable. From childhood, men are told that their worth is measured by what they can endure. But what happens when the weight becomes too much? What happens when a man who is supposed to be unbreakable starts to crack? The modern world celebrates the idea of the self-made man, the lone warrior who carves his destiny without help, without weakness, without emotion. Movies, books, and media glorify figures like the rugged action hero, the stoic billionaire, the relentless worker who sacrifices everything for success. But what is never shown is the cost of this isolation. The truth is, no man is truly self-made. Every great figure in history had support, guidance, and moments of doubt. Yet the myth of absolute independence persists, forcing men into a mindset where asking for help feels like failure. In reality, this illusion creates nothing but loneliness. Society encourages women to express emotions, seek support, and build deep connections. But for men, the same behaviors are often met with ridicule, suspicion, or rejection. A man who cries is told to get over it. A man who shares his struggles is seen as weak. A man who seeks therapy is often ridiculed, even by his peers. This contradiction leaves men in an impossible position. They are told to be human, but punished for showing it. What happens when a man who needs help is too afraid to ask for it? In today's world, the pressure to be a real man has only intensified. Social media bombards men with images of hypermasculinity, wealth, dominance, and perfection. Fitness influencers push the idea that a man's worth is in his physique. Entrepreneurs preach the gospel of 100-hour work weeks. Dating culture demands confidence, success, and status. The message is clear. If you are not excelling in every area, you are failing. But what happens when a man can't keep up? What happens when the pressure becomes suffocating? Many turn to destructive coping mechanisms, addiction, withdrawal, or even anger. Others simply shut down, trapped in a life that no longer feels like their own. What happens when a man finally breaks under the weight of all these expectations? Often the world reacts with shock. He seemed fine, and they say. He never talked about his struggles. The truth is, he was never given the space to. The consequences of this silence are real. Studies show that men are more likely to suffer in silence, leading to higher suicide rates. Men are more prone to stress-related illnesses due to emotional suppression. Men who suppress emotions have higher rates of heart disease, addiction, and mental health disorders. Yet when a man collapses under these pressures, society rarely looks at the system that created the problem. Instead, the focus shifts to the individual. Why didn't he just tough it out? But the real question is, how much longer can men be expected to carry this weight alone? If masculinity is to evolve, the world must first acknowledge the burden it places upon men. Only then can the path to liberation begin. The path to liberation? Redefining masculinity. What if true strength isn't about enduring in silence, but about embracing authenticity? For centuries, men have been taught that resilience means suppressing pain, that leadership means control, and that emotional vulnerability is a weakness. But what if everything we've been told about masculinity is only half the truth? What if true strength lies not in repression, but in the ability to confront, express, and redefine oneself? There's a fine line between resilience and suppression. Resilience is the ability to adapt, to grow stronger through hardship. It is about facing struggles head-on, learning from them, and moving forward. But suppression is something entirely different. It is the habit of burying pain, hiding fear, and pretending everything is fine when it's not. Men are often told that resilience means never showing weakness, but in reality, the strongest men are those who acknowledge their struggles and confront them. Marcus Aurelius, one of history's greatest Stoic philosophers, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." True resilience is not about shutting down emotions. It is about understanding them, working through them, and using them as fuel for growth. Seneca, another Stoic philosopher, spoke at length about adversity and the way it shapes character. He believed that hardship is not something to be feared, but something to be mastered. However, he also warned against self-inflicted suffering. Many men today believe they must endure pain without complaint, as if suffering in silence is a virtue. But Seneca reminds us that pain, when unexamined, leads only to destruction. He wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality. When men refuse to process their struggles, the mind becomes a prison. Worries multiply, stress builds, depression takes hold. But when a man allows himself to face his emotions without shame, he takes back control." The idea that men are naturally less emotional is a lie. Science shows that men and women experience emotions with equal intensity, but men have been trained to suppress them. The problem isn't that men don't feel, it's that they've been conditioned not to express. In his book, The Mask of Masculinity, Lewis Howes describes how men wear different masks to fit into societal expectations. Some wear the mask of the tough guy, never allowing themselves to be vulnerable. Others wear the mask of the joker, hiding their pain behind humor. But true strength comes from removing the mask altogether. Emotional intelligence is not about being weak, it's about understanding yourself. Expressing emotions does not make a man less masculine, it makes him more human. The ability to be vulnerable builds stronger relationships, deeper connections, and lasting self-respect. The old definition of masculinity was built on endurance and silence, but a new definition is emerging, one that embraces both strength and vulnerability. In this new paradigm, A man is strong not because he hides his struggles, but because he faces them. A man is respected not for his ability to endure pain, but for his ability to transform it. A man is powerful not when he suppresses emotion, but when he channels it into wisdom and action. When a man redefines masculinity on his own terms, he frees himself from the invisible weight society has placed upon him. He stops living for the expectations of others and starts living for himself. And in doing so, he discovers what true strength really means. But the final step remains. How does a man actually break the cycle and free himself from this burden? Breaking the cycle. How to free yourself from the burden. Have you ever questioned what it would feel like to let go of this weight? For so long, men have been told to carry their struggles in silence, to bear the weight of expectation without complaint. But what happens when a man decides to break free? What happens when he refuses to let society dictate what strength should look like? The truth is, masculinity is not a prison. It is a choice. And the moment a man realizes this, he begins to reclaim his power. But breaking the cycle is not easy. It requires unlearning years of conditioning, confronting internal fears, and redefining what it means to be a man. So how does one truly free himself from this burden? Step 1. Acknowledging the weight. Many men don't even realize the weight they carry until it becomes unbearable. Suppression becomes second nature. Pain becomes routine. The first step to breaking free is recognizing that this weight exists. Psychologists call this emotional awareness, the ability to identify and understand what we feel. Studies show that men who develop emotional awareness experience less stress, greater mental clarity, and stronger relationships. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. In Buddhism, the first step toward enlightenment is acknowledgement. The Buddha once said, "You yourself must strive. The Buddhas only point the way." No one can take this step for you. No one can free you from this burden but yourself. Step 2. Expressing without fear. Expression is not about oversharing or seeking validation. It is about allowing yourself to be human. For centuries, men have mistaken silence for strength, but history tells a different story. The great Stoic philosopher Epictetus believed that true wisdom came from understanding and articulating one's own experiences. He taught his students that self-expression was the key to self-mastery. He wrote, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." In other words, fear of judgment is the greatest barrier to growth. Expression, whether through conversation, writing, or creative outlets, allows a man to process his emotions instead of letting them consume him. Step 3. Redefining strength on your own terms. Masculinity has always been defined by endurance, by sacrifice, by suffering. But what if strength is something different? What if strength is about knowing when to walk away, when to rest, when to heal? The samurai warriors of Japan practiced seppuku, ritual suicide, when they felt they had dishonored themselves. But a lesser-known truth is that true samurai valued wisdom over war. The greatest warriors were not those who fought the longest, but those who knew when battle was unnecessary. Strength is not just about persistence, it is about adaptability. A strong man is not one who refuses to change, he is one who changes on his own terms. Step 4. Building meaningful connections. A man does not have to walk this path alone. The greatest leaders in history were not lone wolves. They were surrounded by brotherhood, guidance, and support. Socrates had Plato. Marcus Aurelius had his Stoic mentors. Even religious figures like Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Buddha surrounded themselves with disciples. The modern world teaches men to be independent, to rely on no one. But in reality, the most powerful men in history were those who built strong relationships, mentors, friends, and people who challenged them to grow. A man who isolates himself is not strong. A man who builds meaningful connections finds a strength greater than himself. Step 5. Letting go of the need for approval. At the core of masculinity's burden is one truth. Men are taught to live for the expectations of others, to be strong for their families, to be successful for their reputation, to be composed for society. But what happens when a man lets go? What happens when he stops living for approval and starts living for himself? The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche believed that the greatest act of self-liberation was to transcend societal norms and create one's own path. He wrote, "Become who you are." Breaking the cycle is not about rejecting masculinity. It is about reclaiming it. It is about choosing which parts of masculinity serve you and discarding those that do not. It is about walking away from the expectations that weigh you down and defining your own strength. So now the final question remains. What is the heaviest burden you carry, and what would it take to release it? Masculinity is not a sentence. It is not a set of rules written in stone. It is fluid, evolving, and entirely yours to define. For the first time, you have a choice. Carry the weight or let it go. The decision is yours. The liberation of masculinity. Have you ever considered that masculinity is not something to escape, but something to reclaim? For too long, men have carried an invisible weight, a burden they did not choose, yet one they feel obligated to bear. They have been told to be strong, but never vulnerable, to lead, but never question, to endure, but never express. And in the process, they have become prisoners of an outdated ideal, shackled by expectations that no longer serve them. But what if masculinity was never meant to be a burden? What if it was never about suffering in silence, but about embracing the full spectrum of human experience? Strength, resilience, vulnerability, and authenticity. The truth is, men have always had a choice. They have simply been conditioned to believe they do not. The greatest philosophers, warriors, and thinkers in history did not conform to a rigid definition of masculinity. They challenged it, they redefined it, they made it their own. Marcus Aurelius ruled Rome with wisdom, yet privately wrote about his doubts, fears, and struggles in meditations. Socrates, the father of philosophy, embraced humility and questioned everything, refusing to accept the world as it was presented to him. The Buddha, born a prince, walked away from privilege and power to seek truth beyond material success. These men were not weak, they were not fragile, they were free, and that is the real lesson. Masculinity is not a curse, nor is it a rigid mold. It is something to be owned, shaped, and transformed. It is a force that can either confine or liberate, depending on how it is understood. At the end of this journey, the question remains, what kind of man will you choose to be? Not the one society expects, not the one history dictates, but the one who is truly you. To every man who has ever felt trapped by expectations, know this. You are not alone. You never were. And you have nothing to prove except to yourself. The weight of masculinity is only as heavy as you allow it to be. And once you choose to release it, you will realize that the only thing left is freedom.